The wind in Red Mesa had a name, and it was a promise. It came from the east, sweeping across the scorched flats, picking up the topsoil in a fine, rust-colored powder. It wasn't just wind, it was a presence, coating the windows of the El Coyote saloon, sifting under doorways, and painting a thin layer of grit on every glass of whiskey Senora Mena poured. They called it the Red Wind, and it always brought trouble. It was blowing the day Ada Lee stepped off the train. The town was little more than a single dusty street squinting under the 1884 New Mexico sun. It was a place held together by thirst and the Southern Pacific's promise of a rail line. At the heart of that thirst was Coyote Spring, a trickle of life-giving water bubbling up from the parched earth on a patch of land that now belonged to Ada. The deed was in her valise, the last tangible piece of a father she barely remembered. At 19, she was a bookbinder and a typist, her hands accustomed to the smooth feel of paper and the precise click of metal keys, not the splintered reality of a frontier town. She'd barely set her boot on the station platform before they noticed her. 3 men, their clothes stiff with dust and indolence, detached themselves from the shade of the water tower. The one in the lead, a man with a frayed rope for a belt and a stained grin, was Tumbleweed Jack. "Well, look what the train blew in," he drawled, his voice like gravel. He blocked her path, his friends fanning out beside him. "Ain't you a little too clean for Red Mesa, ma'am?" Ada clutched her valise. "Excuse me, I need to get to the land office." "Land office?" Jack chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Big plans for a little thing like you." He reached for her bag. "Let's see what you got in there. Deeds and documents." "Maybe." Ada pulled back sharply. "That's my property?" "Everything in Red Mesa is somebody's property," Jack said, his eyes narrowing. "Or it will be." A shadow fell over them, long and quiet. "The lady asked you to excuse her." The voice was low and calm, with no wasted words. Ada looked up to see a man whose stillness was more commanding than Jack's swagger. He was tall, dressed in worn denim and leather, a Lone Star Ranch brand on his chaps. His face was weathered by sun and thought, and his eyes, the color of a faded blue sky, missed nothing. He wasn't looking at Jack, but at Ada, a silent question in his gaze. "Tumbleweed." Jack bristled. "This ain't your business. Boone." "She's new in town," the man named Boone said, his voice even. "Makes it the town's business. Now, back away." There was no threat in his tone, just a statement of fact, as unmovable as the mesa itself. Jack hesitated, sizing up the quiet cowboy. He saw the worn grip of the Colt on Cass Boone's hip, the patient set of his shoulders. He saw a man who didn't make idle suggestions, with a sneer and a muttered curse. Jack and his men shuffled away, melting back into the dusty landscape. "Cass Boone," the cowboy said, touching the brim of his hat. He didn't offer a hand, just a nod. "You must be William Liga's girl." "Ada." Ada was taken aback. "You knew my father." "I knew of him." Cass said, "Good man. Welcome to Red Mesa. You'll want to watch your step." He gestured toward the street. "The land office is that way. I'll walk with you." The real trouble, Ada soon learned, didn't wear a frayed rope belt. It wore a tailored suit and a silver star. Silas Crowell owned most of the land around Red Mesa, and what he didn't own, he intended to. He found her the next morning at the small room she'd rented above the general store. With him was Sheriff Ephraim Pike, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his vest and whose eyes had the dull, predatory gleam of a lizard. Crowell smiled, a flash of white teeth in a sun-browned face. He was handsome in a way that set Ada's teeth on edge. "Miss Lee," he began, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "A pleasure. I was a great friend of your father's. It's a tragedy. His passing. A great tragedy." Ada remained standing. "I didn't know my father had friends here." "Oh, indeed. So much so, Crowell continued, pulling a folded paper from his coat, that I find myself in the unfortunate position of being his creditor, or rather, your former guardian's. He handed her the paper. It was a promissory note, signed by the distant uncle who had raised her, pledging the Coyote Spring property against a substantial loan. Your uncle, it seems, had a taste for bad investments. Ada's blood ran cold as she stared at the familiar, looping signature. It looked real. This can't be. He never mentioned a debt. Men of pride rarely do, Crowell said with false sympathy. The note is due, of course. A young woman like yourself can't be expected to have such a sum. But I am a reasonable man. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. There is another way to settle this. A union between our families. A marriage. It would consolidate the land, secure your future, and protect you. Red Mesa is no place for a woman alone. Sheriff Pike shifted his weight, the floorboards creaking. His presence was the unspoken threat. The law was on Crowell's side. Ada felt the walls of the small room closing in. This was her mother's story, retold in dust and heat, a cage, offered as a sanctuary. I'll have to think about it, she managed, her voice a thin thread. Of course, Crowell said, his smile never faltering. But don't think too long. The railroad is coming. Property values are a fluid thing. She spent the rest of the day in a haze of quiet panic, the red wind whispering at her window. She was trapped if she refused. Crowell would foreclose, and the law, in the form of Sheriff Pike, would enforce it, if she agreed. She would lose the one thing her father had left her a chance at a life of her own making. The land, the spring. It wasn't just property, it was freedom. That evening, a light knock came at her door. It was Cass Boone. He held his hat in his hands, his posture respectful. He'd heard the talk. He said Senora Mena had told him the town was small and Crowell's ambitions were large. He can't do that, Ada said, the words more a plea than a statement. The debt note, it must be a forgery. Proving it is the trick, Cass said. The circuit judge only comes through once a month. He's due next week. Until then, Crowell's paper is as good as law, with Pike backing him. He looked at her, his gaze direct. There might be one way to protect your claim. Ada waited, her hope a fragile thing. The law in this territory is particular about a married woman's property, he said, speaking slowly, deliberately. A husband has to sign off on any sale or forfeiture of land held in his wife's name. Crowell can't touch it if you're married. The hope shattered. So I'm to trade Mr. Crowell's cage for another. No, ma'am, Cass said quickly. Not a real one. A marriage on paper. Just until the judge arrives. A legal shield, nothing more. My name on a document to keep you safe. Ada stared at him, searching his face for a hint of deception, a flicker of the same proprietary gleam she'd seen in Crowell's eyes. She found none. There was only a quiet earnestness. Why? Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me. Cass looked down at the hat in his hands, turning it over and over. Your father, William Lee. He pulled me out of a frozen creek up on the Cimarron a few years back. My horse had gone through the ice. He saved my life. I figure I owe him a debt. Keeping his land safe for his daughter seems a fair way to start paying it. A marriage of convenience. The idea was absurd. A fiction from one of the dime novels she sometimes rebound. But in Red Mesa, it was suddenly the most practical solution she could imagine. A lie to fight a lie. She thought of her mother, of a life spent in silent compliance. A spark of her father's defiance flickered within her. I need to think, she said. He nodded. I'll be at the El Coyote. Crowell didn't give her time to think. He must have sensed her hesitation, her search for another way out. He sent his hounds. As Ada crossed the street that night, heading for the relative safety of the saloon. Tumbleweed. Jack and his friends emerged from an alley, cutting her off. Changed your mind about being friendly? Jack sneered, the smell of cheap whiskey rolling off him. He was closer this time, his grin uglier. Mister, Crowell thinks you need convincing. Thinks you need to see how much a lady needs protection around here. He lunged for her arm. Ada cried out and stumbled back, but the wall was right behind her. A single gunshot cracked through the evening air, deafening in the narrow space. It wasn't loud and booming, but sharp, final. Ada flinched, seeing the pistol that had appeared in Jack's hand go spinning through the air, clattering against the far wall of the alley. Jack yelped, clutching his stinging hand. Cass Boone stood at the mouth of the alley, smoke curling from the barrel of his Colt, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever. "I believe," Cass said, his voice dangerously soft. "The time for convincing is over." Jack stared at his empty, throbbing hand, then at the unwavering gun in Boone's grip, and scrambled away into the darkness, his friends close behind. Cass holstered his pistol in a smooth, practiced motion. He walked toward Ada, stopping a few feet away. The dust was settling. The red wind had died down, and in the sudden quiet, she could hear her own heart hammering against her ribs. He hadn't killed the man. He had simply removed the threat, with a precision that was both terrifying and reassuring. She looked at him, at the quiet cowboy who carried a life debt to her father. She saw the alley, the dust, the looming shadows, and she saw the path Crowell was laying for her. Then she looked at Cass Boone and saw a different path. It was a strange and uncertain one, but it was a choice, her choice. "All right, Mr. Boone," she said, her voice steady now. "Clear as the coming night, a marriage on paper." He gave a single, decisive nod. "Ada." "Cass," she corrected herself, the name feeling foreign and yet right on her tongue. The land office was closed, but the clerk was easily found at the saloon. He grumbled, his eyes shifting nervously as he lit a lamp in the small, stuffy room. He was Crowell's man, that much was clear, but the law was the law. He pulled out the forms. They stood side by side, two strangers under the sallow lamplight. The clerk's pen scratched across the paper, filling in their names. Ada Lee, Cass Boone. It looked like a lie. It felt like the truest thing she had ever done. She signed her name, the ink stark against the page. Cass signed his below hers, his hand steady. They walked out into the cool desert night. The wind had stopped. The stars were brilliant in the black sky, sharp and clear. They were husband and wife, bound by a document in a dusty office and the shared purpose of seeing justice done. They did not touch. They did not speak of the future beyond next week's court. They were allies in a war that had just begun, and for the first time since arriving in Red Mesa. Ada Lee did not feel alone. The air was still, but she knew the red wind would be back. The cabin by Coyote Spring was less a house and more a suggestion. It was built of rough-hewn cottonwood, with gaps in the walls that let in slivers of sunlight by day and the mournful cry of the spring's namesake by night. It had two small rooms. Ada took the one with the window, and Cass took the one with the draft. There was no argument. He moved a cot and his saddlebags into the smaller room and closed the door, creating a boundary as solid as any wall. Their marriage existed only on a piece of paper in the land office, and his every action respected that fact. He spent the first days helping her. They worked in a shared silence, punctuated by the rhythmic thump of the post-hole digger and the squeak of the hand-cranked well drill. He showed her how to stretch wire for a fence, his large, calloused hands guiding hers until she could pull it taut and staple it fast. He was a patient teacher, his instructions sparse but clear. Keep your weight back. Watch for snakes in the woodpile. The sun is honest here. It'll tell you when to rest. He was building a fence to protect her land, but he was also building a wall of propriety around her, a clear demarcation for the rest of the town to see. The town, however, chose to see what it wanted. The rumor started in the El Coyote, a poison whispered by Silas Crowell into a willing ear, and from there it spread like a grass fire. It wasn't just that Cass Boone had married the newcomer. It was how and why. The story was that he hadn't married her at all, but purchased her, bought her like a prize heifer. The deed to her land, the dowry, and her virtue, the final clause in the contract. Crowell's lie was clever. It twisted Cass's act of protection into one of possession and painted Ada not as a landowner defending her rights, but as a commodity. Ada felt the sting of it first at the general store. The women who had nodded politely the week before now found sudden interest in barrels of flour or bolts of calico when she approached. Conversations would hush, replaced by the rustle of skirts and averted eyes. Young Tommy, the boy who ran messages and idolized Cass, reported the talk he heard, his face scrunched in loyal indignation. "They're saying awful things. Miss Ada, Mr. Crowell is..." The hurt was a cold knot in her stomach. It wasn't fair. She had spent her life prizing her independence, her ability to make her own way with her mind and her hands. Now, in this town, she was being reduced to a single, crude definition. She wrestled with the shame, the anger. Her first instinct was to hide, to stay at the cabin until the circuit judge arrived. But that felt like a surrender. It felt like what her mother would have done. On Sunday, she put on her best dress, a simple gray poplin, and walked into town for church. Cass, seeing her purpose, saddled his horse without a word and rode at a respectful distance behind her buggy. When she walked through the doors of the small adobe church, a wave of silence followed her up the aisle. She held her head high, her gaze fixed on the altar, and slid into a pew near the front. She could feel the weight of their stares on her back. Father Dunn, a man with kind eyes and a spine of steel, met her gaze and gave a small, encouraging nod. His sermon that morning was on the 9th commandment. He spoke of bearing false witness, of the poison of gossip, and of how a person's true character is revealed not by the stories told about them, but by their own actions. He looked directly at the pew where Silas Crowell and Sheriff Pike sat, his meaning as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. After the service, the priest made a point of shaking her hand. "God finds courage in quiet places. My child," he said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Welcome to Red Mesa." It was a small victory, but it was a start. It showed Ada that the entire town was not against her. There was decency here, too, if you knew where to look. When she returned to the cabin, she felt a new resolve hardening inside her. She would not be a victim. She would be a fighter. That afternoon, she asked Cass to teach her how to shoot. He didn't question her. He simply took a rifle from its scabbard, its wood smooth and dark with age. "This was my father's," he said. "It's balanced. It shoots true." They walked out past the spring. He showed her how to stand, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to breathe out slow before squeezing the trigger. "Don't pull it," he said, his voice calm beside her ear. "You'll jerk the shot. Just squeeze. Let it be a surprise." The first shot kicked hard, bruising her shoulder, and went wide. The second was better. By the 10th, she was hitting the tin can he'd set on a rock 50 yards away. The methodical process, the focus it required, calmed her mind. This, too, was a tool, another way to protect what was hers. As she practiced with the rifle, she also devoted her evenings to her father's books. Tucked among volumes of poetry and history, she found a small, leather-bound book of primer on territorial land and water rights. She read it by candlelight, the dense legal language slowly becoming a map, a weapon of a different kind. Their life fell into a quiet rhythm. They were two people living parallel lives on the same small patch of dirt, their paths intersecting over meals and chores. A respectful distance always remained, yet a bond was forming, unspoken, forged in shared purpose in the heat of the desert sun. The violence, when it came, was as petty as it was cruel. It came in the form of Asa Pike, the sheriff's younger brother, a man who possessed all of Ephraim's meanness with none of his cunning. One evening, Cass rode out to check on a report of a mountain lion troubling the herds. Ada was alone. Asa and two of his friends, emboldened by liquor from the El Coyote, chose that night to pay her a visit. They didn't come to the cabin, they went for the well. Ada heard the splintering crash of wood and the drunken laughter from inside. She looked out the window and saw them, silhouettes in the moonlight, wrecking the drilling rig, kicking dirt and rocks down the half-dug hole. It was their hope they were burying. Suddenly, a small figure darted out from behind the woodpile. It was Tommy. He must have been bringing a message. He shouted something at the men, his young voice cracking with outrage. Asa turned, saw the boy, and laughed. He lunged forward, not with a fist, but with a casual, brutal shove. Tommy tripped backward over a pile of rocks, his head striking the ground with a sickening thud. He didn't get up. The men laughed again and melted back into the night. Ada didn't think. She grabbed a lantern and ran outside. Tommy was conscious but dazed, a dark gash bleeding freely from his hairline. She helped him to his feet, her arm around his thin shoulders, and guided him into the cabin. She sat him at the table, her hands moving with a purpose she didn't know she had. She had seen Cass treat a wounded horse once, his movements economical and sure. She emulated that calm. She washed the cut gently with water from the spring. It was deep, right down to the bone. It needed stitches. Her mind raced. The doctor was miles away. But then her eyes fell on her bookbinding kit, the strong linen thread, the sharp, curved needles. She took a deep breath. This is going to hurt. Tommy, she said softly, but you have to hold still for me. Can you be brave? The boy, his face pale in the lamplight, nodded, his trust in her absolute. She sterilized the needle and thread in the lantern's flame, just as she'd read in a book about field medicine. Her hands, usually so steady with paper and glue, trembled slightly as she made the first stitch. But then the practiced discipline of her craft took over. She closed the wound with small, neat stitches, her movements as precise as if she were sewing the spine of a book. When she was done, she bandaged his head with a strip of clean linen. The symbol of her work was now a symbol of healing. When Cass returned, he found her sitting by the fire, Tommy asleep on the cot she'd insisted he take. He saw the bandage, the blood on her apron, the wrecked well rig. She told him everything, her voice low and tight with a cold fury. He listened without interrupting, his face a mask of stone. When she finished, he knelt and gently checked Tommy's bandage, his touch surprisingly deft. "You did good work, Ada," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. He looked at the sleeping boy, then back at her. "This goes beyond Crowell. This is Pike's doing." He stood up and went outside. He came back with the rifle. "From now on, this stays by the door." The sandstorm hit 2 nights later. It came without warning, a monstrous wall of red dust that blotted out the moon and stars. The wind screamed like a banshee, rattling the cabin to its foundations. Sand found its way through every crack, coating their tongues, stinging their eyes. It was a force of nature that made a man feel small and helpless. Through the howling gale, Ada heard a different sound, a frightened, desperate bawling. The 2 young calves she had bought were in the small lean-to Cass had built. Something was wrong. Peering through the dusty window pane, she saw it a flicker of orange, a small, hungry flame licking at the dry wood of the lean-to, impossibly alive in the heart of the storm. And then she saw a man's shape, hunched against the wind, his back to her. Asa Pike. He was using the storm as his cover, turning a natural disaster into a malicious attack. Cass was out in the small barn, securing the horse. He wouldn't hear her over the wind. She was alone. The rifle was by the door. Without a second of hesitation, she grabbed it. It was heavy, real in her hands. She remembered Cass's words. "Brace it. Breathe out." Squeeze. She flung the door open, the wind tearing it from her grasp and slamming it against the cabin wall. She leaned into the storm, grit blasting her face. She couldn't see Asa clearly, just a shifting shadow against the growing fire. She wasn't aiming for him. She was aiming for the space beside him. She fired. The rifle's roar was swallowed by the wind, but the muzzle flash was a brilliant star in the swirling darkness. The shadow figure of Asa yelped and scrambled away, swallowed by the red night. Ada ran, her skirts whipping around her legs, and used a horse blanket to beat out the flames before they could take hold. The calves, terrified but unharmed, huddled in the far corner. When the storm finally blew itself out near dawn, the world was hushed and coated in red. Cass found her sitting on the cabin steps, the rifle across her lap, watching the sun rise over a transformed landscape. He saw the scorched patch on the lean-to, the single set of tracks leading away from it, tracks that weren't his or hers. She didn't have to say a word. That night, they sat by a small campfire, the air still and cool. The failed attack had been a test, a trial by fire and wind, and she had not broken. She had not even bent. Cass stared into the flames, his face grim. "In the cavalry," he said, his voice quiet. "I saw what happens when men like Asa Pike aren't stopped. They start with animals and property. It never ends there." He picked up a stick and drew a line in the dust. "This is finished. Crowell's land grab is one thing. This is another. When that judge gets here, I'm not just testifying about a fraudulent note. I'm testifying to attempted arson. To assault." He looked up from the fire, his eyes meeting hers across the flickering light, and in them she saw a promise colder and harder than any legal document. "I'll see him stand trial for what he did to that boy. And for this, I swear it." The words hung in the air between them, a vow more binding than the one they'd made in the land office. It was a new contract, sealed not by ink, but by fire and a shared resolve for a justice that was real, not just written on paper. Ada nodded, a silent partner to his oath. She was no longer just protecting her land. She was fighting for the soul of the town itself. A new sound came to Red Mesa, a nervous, insistent chatter that cut through the steady drone of the wind. It was the sound of the telegraph, a single strand of steel wire that now connected their dusty isolation to the rest of the world. The telegraph office was a small addition built onto the side of the post office, and it was run by a man named Mr. Patel, a prim gentleman from a far-off land with dark, intelligent eyes and ink-stained fingers. The staccato clicking of his machine was the town's new pulse, tapping out messages of commerce, news, and greed. Ada, drawn to the precision of the work, found herself spending more and more time there. Mr. Patel, overwhelmed by the volume of traffic from ranchers and the railroad surveyors, was grateful for an assistant who could not only write a clear hand, but also understand the importance of discretion. He hired her for a few hours each day to transcribe incoming messages and prepare outgoing ones. It was a position of trust, and for Ada, it was a listening post. She became an expert in the secret language of the wire, in the small pauses and rhythms that spoke as much as the words themselves, and she listened, especially for the messages of Silas Crowell. His business flowed through that wire daily, a river of code charting his acquisitions and ambitions. He was buying up land, securing water rights, and communicating in terse, coded language with lawyers in Santa Fe. Cass watched her new employment with a quiet approval. Since the night of the fire, Sheriff Pike had made a show of investigating, but the inquiry was a sham. He questioned Asa's drunken friends, who provided alibis for each other and declared the fire an accident caused by the storm. Cass's vow to see Asa in court was stymied by a corrupt system where the lawman's brother was above the law. Their hope rested entirely on the circuit judge and the fraudulent debt note. They needed more. Ada found it on a Tuesday afternoon. A message came in for Crowell from a clerk in the county seat. It was a simple confirmation. Document 734B water rights transfer filed. Seal affixed as instructed. Ada felt a prickle of unease. She had memorized every page of her father's primer on territorial law. Water rights were deeded with the land. They weren't separate, transferable documents unless under specific public circumstances. And what did as instructed mean for a legal seal? Working from memory of the documents she'd filed, she sent a query under the guise of a records check from a fictional law office in another territory. An hour later, the answer clicked back across the wire. Document 734A was a land sale in a different county. 734B did not exist in the official record. It was a ghost. Crowell hadn't just forged a debt note. He had fabricated a legal history, creating a false water right he could seize even if he lost the claim on her land itself. He was building a cage of paper around her spring. And the county seal, the very symbol of legal authority, was his lockpick. A cold, clear anger settled over Ada. She now held a piece of the truth, transmitted invisibly along a humming steel wire. Just as this new knowledge armed her, a new threat rode into town. He was a tall man with a long, dark coat and a face as blank and hard as a slab of rock. He moved with an unnerving economy, his eyes constantly scanning, missing nothing. He wore 2 low-slung pistols, tied down to his thighs. The whispers in the El Coyote gave him a name, Dutch Rook, a hired gun. Everyone knew who had hired him. He did not approach Ada. His business was with Cass. He would appear at the edge of the Lone Star Ranch property. Just watching, he would sit in the saloon, nursing a single whiskey, his chair against the back wall. He was a professional, a patient predator, and his presence was a constant, unspoken message to Cass back down. The first time Cass saw him up close, Ada was with him at the blacksmith shop. Choate, the smithy, was fitting a new shoe on her buggy horse. The man in the dark coat walked past, and for a single, fleeting moment, his eyes met Cass's. Ada felt Cass go utterly still beside her, a tension coiling in him that was different from his usual quiet watchfulness. It was something deeper, more personal. "Who is that man?" she asked quietly as Rook continued down the street. "Trouble," Cass said, his voice flat, but his eyes followed the man with a look Ada had never seen before, a flicker of old pain, buried under years of dust. He knew him. The confrontation happened at the public watering trough, the only source of water for travelers and those who didn't own a private well. It was a place of truce, a neutral ground. Crowell and Dutch Rook chose to violate it. Cass was filling a water barrel for the cabin, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. Ada was waiting in the buggy. Crowell rode up with Rook and Sheriff Pike, blocking the path. "Boone," Crowell said, his voice pleasant. "Working hard. I see, on my property." "This is Miss Lee's property," Cass said, not turning around, continuing to work the pump. "And you know it." "The courts will decide what's what," Crowell said. "But in the meantime, I hear you've been making threats against the sheriff's brother, spreading slander. That's a dangerous habit." Dutch Rook dismounted, his spurs jingling softly. He walked toward Cass, his movements fluid, like a cat. "Sometimes," Rook said, his voice a low rasp, "a man needs to be taught to mind his own affairs." Cass stopped pumping. He turned slowly, every line of his body alert. He looked past Rook, directly at Crowell. "If you have something to say, Crowell, say it. Don't send your dog." Rook smiled, a thin, mirthless stretching of his lips. "The dog's the one that bites." It happened faster than Ada could process. Rook's hand blurred toward his gun, but Cass was already moving. He didn't draw. He lunged forward, using the pump handle as a lever, shoving it hard into Rook's midsection. The gunman grunted, the air knocked out of him, but he was a professional. As he stumbled back, his other hand came up, and there was a flash of metal. Not a gun, a knife. Cass sidestepped the wild slash, grabbing Rook's wrist and twisting. The knife clattered to the dusty ground. For a moment, They were locked in a brutal, silent struggle. Then Pike moved, drawing his pistol. "That's enough. Boone, you're under arrest for assault." It was the opening Rook needed. As Cass's head turned toward the sheriff, Rook broke free and slammed a fist into Cass's side. Cass staggered, and in that instant, Rook drew his gun. He didn't aim to kill. He was a craftsman. A shot rang out, and Cass cried out, a sharp intake of breath, clutching his right shoulder as he fell back against the trough. Blood bloomed dark on his shirt. His gun arm was useless. Ada screamed. Pike and Crowell just watched, their faces impassive. This was the plan. A public disabling. A lesson taught. Rook raised his pistol again, this time aiming lower. Ada didn't think. She grabbed the horsewhip from the buggy and, with a cry of pure rage, lashed out. The whip cracked through the air, catching Rook across the face. He roared in pain and surprise, a red line instantly appearing on his cheek. The distraction was all Cass needed. He lunged with his good arm. Tackling Rook at the knees, they went down in a heap. Crowell spurred his horse forward. "Get off him! Boone!" Ada knew they had only seconds. Pike was raising his gun again. There was only one escape, while the men were tangled on the ground. She scrambled from the buggy, ran to Cass's horse, and grabbed the reins. "Cass!" she screamed. "Now!" He heard her. He rolled away from Rook and, using his left arm, pulled himself to his feet. He was bleeding badly, his face pale. He stumbled toward the horse. Ada, her hands shaking, was already yanking the telegraph key from her satchel. She had brought it home to practice. She fumbled with the wires, connecting them to the small battery in her bag. Her fingers flew, tapping out a frantic, desperate message. SOS, CROWELL, ROOK, CASSHURT, WATERTROUGH, SENDHELP. She didn't know if the wire she'd strung to a nearby fence post would carry the signal, but it was the only chance she had. She aimed her plea at the one person she knew would be listening, Senora Mena, whose nephew worked with Mr. Patel. Cass staggered, nearly falling. "Can't ride," he gasped. "You have to," she said, her voice fierce. She practically shoved him into the saddle, his body slumping forward. She grabbed the reins of both horses and swung herself up onto the buggy seat. She lashed the reins, and the horses bolted. They galloped out of town, leaving the shouts and chaos behind. She didn't head for the open plains. She headed for the high country, for a narrow, winding pass through the mesas known as Devil's Backbone. It was a shortcut, but a treacherous one. As they climbed, the sky, which had been clear moments before, turned a bruised purple. The air grew thick, charged with electricity. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. The storm that had been threatening for days was finally breaking. They were halfway through the pass when the lightning started. Jagged spears of white light that struck the high peaks around them. The thunder was deafening. A physical blow. The horses shied, their eyes rolling in terror. Cass was barely conscious, swaying in the saddle. "Hold on, Cass!" Ada gritted out, her knuckles white on the reins. "Just hold on." A bolt of lightning struck a pinnacle of rock not 50 feet away, and the world went white and silent, followed by a deafening crack and the smell of ozone. In that brilliant, terrifying flash of light, she saw Cass's face. His eyes were open, and in them, she saw not just pain, but a deep, haunting fear. "Miller," he breathed, the name a ghost on his lips. "His name is Jacob Miller. We were cavalry scouts together. He left us in an ambush, rode away and left 3 men to die. I was the only one who made it back." The revelation struck Ada with the force of the lightning. This wasn't just a hired gun. This was Cass's past, a betrayal he had carried in silence, riding back into his life wearing a new name. His fear wasn't for himself. It was the terror of losing someone again, of being the sole survivor once more. She urged the horses on, the path growing slick as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. She could hear shouting behind them, the sound of pursuit. Rook was coming. She risked a glance back and saw them, 3 riders silhouetted by another flash of lightning. Then the rain came in earnest. A solid wall of water that turned the clay path to greasy mud. It was a blessing and a curse, washing away their tracks but making every step a gamble. The buggy slid, a wheel catching on a rock. With a splintering crack, the axle broke. They were stranded. "Go!" Cass gasped, trying to pull his gun with his left hand. "Take the horse! Leave me!" "No," Ada said, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "I am not leaving you." She jumped down, untangled his horse's reins, and pulled him from the saddle. He leaned heavily on her, his breathing shallow. She looked around, desperate. The pursuit was getting closer. Then she saw it, a narrow crevice in the rock face, hidden by a curtain of rain and shadow. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she half-dragged, half-carried Cass into the opening, pulling the horses in after them just as the riders galloped past their wrecked buggy, their curses lost in the roar of the storm. They were safe, for the moment, huddled in the dark, damp crevice. Ada tore a strip from her petticoat and pressed it hard against Cass's shoulder, trying to staunch the bleeding. The rain poured down, a cleansing, life-giving flood. It hammered on the rocks, ran in rivers down the pass, and flowed toward the valley, toward the dry earth, toward the thirsty mouth of Coyote Spring. The storm was washing the world clean. Ada held on to Cass in the darkness, listening to the thunder and the rain. And for the first time, she felt the tide begin to turn. She had not been rescued. She had done the rescuing. The storm broke as quickly as it had begun, leaving behind a world washed clean and silent. The air, stripped of its dust, smelled of wet earth and sage. They found the cabin tucked into a fold of the hills, a relic left behind by some hopeful miner long ago. Its roof was sagging and a shutter hung from a single leather hinge, but its stone chimney was solid and its 4 walls were sound. It was shelter. It was enough. Inside, it was damp and cold, smelling of old ashes and decay. While Ada tethered the horses in a lean-to that was miraculously still standing, Cass, moving with a stiff deliberation that betrayed the depth of his pain, managed to build a fire in the hearth. He used the last of their dry matches, his left hand clumsy but determined. By the time Ada came back inside, a small, courageous flame was battling the gloom, pushing back the shadows. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder, a wound that was less dangerous than it was debilitating, but he had lost a lot of blood, and the cold had settled deep into his bones. Ada made him sit on the single rickety chair while she tore more strips from her petticoat. She found a flask of whiskey in his saddlebag. "This will burn," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He just nodded, his eyes closed, his face pale in the firelight. She poured the raw spirit over the wound, and he hissed, his whole body going rigid. But he made no other sound. She packed the entry and exit wounds as best she could and bound his shoulder tightly, her bookbinder's hands moving with a practiced gentleness. He was dependent on her, and the reversal of their roles was a profound and sobering thing. His strength had been a shield for her. Now, her care was his only medicine. They sat in silence for a long time after, listening to the fire crackle and the drip of water from the eaves. The shared ordeal had stripped away the careful boundaries they had built. In the small, fire-lit cabin, there was no room for anything but the truth. "Sarah," Cass said, his voice a low rasp. He didn't open his eyes. That was her name. Ada waited, her hands folded in her lap. She was a schoolteacher in a town not much bigger than Red Mesa. We were to be married. He took a slow, ragged breath. Jacob Miller, the man who calls himself Rook. He was my corporal. We trusted him. He led our patrol into a box canyon, said he'd scouted it clear, but he'd made a deal. He rode away, and they were waiting for us. I was the only one who got out. He finally opened his eyes, and they were filled with a bleakness that chilled Ada to the core. When I made it back to the town, it was too late. They'd raided it, for supplies, for horses, for sport. The schoolhouse was the first place they went. I found her there. He didn't need to say more. The story was in the haunted emptiness of his gaze, in the permanent tension in his shoulders. It wasn't just the betrayal that Rook represented. It was the catastrophic loss that followed. His fear in the lightning storm hadn't been for his own life. It was the echo of a helplessness he had sworn never to feel again. He had failed to protect the person he loved, and the ghost of that failure had been riding with him ever since. Ada felt her own throat tighten, not with pity, but with a deep, aching empathy. His story resonated with a fear she knew intimately, a fear of being powerless while others decided your fate. The firelight flickered, casting their shadows long and dancing on the rough wooden walls. "When I was 15, she began, her voice quiet but steady. "My uncle, the one who signed Crowell's false note, he fell into debt with a traveling show, a circus. The man who ran it was a collector of oddities. He saw my hair." She touched a loose strand of her auburn hair, which gleamed like copper in the light. "He thought it was unusual. He offered to buy out my uncle's debt." She paused, the memory still sharp, still humiliating. It wasn't a formal contract. It was a discussion between two men about a piece of property. My uncle was considering it. "For a week. I didn't know if I would be sent to school to learn a trade or sent to a cage to be stared at. I would lie awake at night and hear them talking in the parlor. They weren't talking about me, Ada. They were talking about the girl, an asset to be liquidated." She looked at Cass, her eyes holding his. "The deal fell through, but I never forgot the feeling that my life, my body, my future was something that could be bartered and sold, that the choice was not my own." She saw understanding dawn in his eyes. He finally knew the true root of her fierce independence, the terror that Crowell's proposal had ignited in her. It was not just about land or freedom in the abstract. It was about the absolute, fundamental right to her own personhood. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. In the warm, enclosed space, their two histories of loss and fear intertwined, creating a new and powerful understanding. They were not so different. The quiet cowboy and the determined bookbinder, both were survivors, marked by the past, fighting for a future of their own choosing. Ada shifted on the floor, moving closer to the hearth, to him. The air was charged with all the things they had never said, with the respect that had grown between them, with the undeniable current that had flowed beneath their practical arrangement. She looked at him, at the lines of pain and exhaustion etched on his face, at the strength that even a bullet couldn't erase. "I'm not like other girls," she said, the words coming out soft but clear, a statement of fact, not of pride. He watched her, his expression unreadable. She took a breath, claiming her truth. "I'm a virgin because I chose to be, not because I was frightened or sheltered. I chose to wait for a day when I would not be a bargain or a prize or a contract. I chose to wait until I could stand before a man as his equal and give myself freely because I wanted to, not because I was obligated." A long, silent moment stretched between them. The only sound was the sigh of the fire. A slow, gentle smile touched Cass's lips, a smile that reached his eyes and washed away some of the bleakness. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated recognition. He had seen her, truly seen her, from the very beginning. He reached out with his good hand, not to touch her, but placing it flat over his own heart. His voice was low, rough with emotion, but it was the steadiest thing she had ever heard. "That's why I love you," he said. The words were simple, direct, and they landed in the center of her soul. "Because you choose." And tonight, he held her gaze, his blue eyes clear and certain. "I choose you, forever." It was not a proposal. It was a vow, a declaration of an allegiance that went far beyond any legal document. It was the meeting of two souls who had fought for their own autonomy and now, in this broken-down cabin, chose to bind themselves to one another. He was not claiming her. He was choosing her. And in that, he was offering her the one thing she had always craved, a choice that was answered with a choice. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She reached out and placed her hand over his, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her palm. It was the only answer he needed. The space between them dissolved, and he leaned forward, his face gentle in the firelight. He kissed her, a kiss that was not about passion, but about promise. It was tender and respectful, a seal on the words they had spoken, a quiet celebration of finding a home in the most unexpected of places. They held each other for a long time, two survivors finding warmth in a cold, unforgiving world. There was no need for anything more. The choice had been made. They slept by the fire, Ada on a blanket on the floor, Cass slumped in the chair, his head resting against the stone of the hearth. For the first time, their separate spaces had merged into a shared one. It was a peaceful, dreamless sleep, the sleep of soldiers after a battle. The next morning, the world was reborn. The sun rose into a sky of impossible clarity, the air so clean it was like drinking cool water. Every rock and cactus was etched in sharp relief. The land was washed, and so were they. Cass's shoulder was stiff and sore, but the fever had not set in. As Ada checked the dressing, he watched her, a new light in his eyes. "When this is over," he said, "when Crowell is beaten and the land is truly yours, this marriage on paper, I want it to be real." "I know," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "I want that, too." There was no church, no priest, no witnesses. There was only the morning sun slanting through the dusty window, and the promise they had made in the night. Cass stood up and walked to the rough-hewn beam that ran across the center of the cabin. He drew the knife he kept in his boot. With his left hand, he slowly, carefully began to carve into the wood. The letters were clumsy, uneven, but the intent was perfect. 2 words, a testament to the night the world had changed. Then a third. "Chose her forever." He stepped back, and they looked at it together. It was their own ceremony, their true beginning. It was a promise carved in wood, more permanent and more binding than any signature on a piece of paper. They had a battle yet to fight, but now they would fight it together, not as allies of convenience, but as 2 people who had chosen their own destiny, and each other. The bell in the church steeple began to toll, not for a service, but for the law. It was a flat, clangorous sound that carried across the dusty street, calling the people of Red Mesa not to prayer, but to judgment. The circuit court was in session, convened in the largest room the town had to offer, the El Coyote Saloon. The tables had been pushed against the walls, and rows of benches had been brought in, creating a makeshift courtroom that smelled of stale beer, sawdust, and nervous sweat. Judge Alistair Beaumont presided, a man as dry and weathered as the territory itself. He was stooped with age, his face a roadmap of hard-won wisdom, but his eyes, behind a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles, were as sharp and discerning as a hawk's. He looked out over the crowded room, his gaze lingering for a moment on Silas Crowell, who sat at the plaintiff's table looking supremely confident in a tailored suit, flanked by a smirking Sheriff Pike. Then the judge's eyes found Ada and Cass. They sat alone at the defendant's table. Cass was a statue of coiled stillness, his right arm in a clean sling, his left hand resting on his thigh. Inches from the Colt he was permitted to keep as a sworn officer of his own defense. He was Ada's guardian, her protector, his presence a silent declaration. Ada sat straight-backed, her hands clutching a small leather valise on her lap. Inside was her father's law primer and the flimsy telegraph transcripts that felt as thin as a prayer against Crowell's power. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but overlaying it was the hard, clear resolve that had been forged in the storm and fire. Crowell's lawyer, a slick man from Santa Fe, presented his case with practiced ease. He produced the promissory note, passed it to the judge, and spoke of a simple matter of an unpaid debt and a prearranged settlement. He painted Ada as a naive girl and Crowell as a benevolent landowner, a pillar of the community, merely seeking what was rightfully his. It all sounded so reasonable, so legal. The knot in Ada's stomach tightened. "Mrs. Boone," the judge said, his voice creaking like old leather. The name still sounded strange to her ears. "You have no legal counsel. Do you wish to respond to these claims?" Ada stood up, her legs trembling slightly. "I do, Your Honor." She took a breath, the faces of the townspeople a blur before her. "And my name is Ada Lee." She would not use the fiction of her marriage as a shield. She would stand on her own name. The claim is based on a fraudulent document. The lawyer scoffed. "A serious accusation. Ma'am, do you have proof?" "I have a witness," Ada said, her voice growing stronger. "I call Mr. Patel to the stand." The telegraph operator made his way to the front, a small, neat man clutching his record book as if it were a holy text. He swore the oath, his voice barely a whisper. Ada guided him through his testimony, her questions simple and direct. He told the court about the messages Crowell had sent and received, about the specific reference to a document 734B related to water rights for the Coyote Spring parcel. "And did you, at my request, query the county records office about this document?" Ada asked. "I did, Mr. Patel confirmed. He read from his logbook. The reply came from the chief clerk himself. Document 734A is a cattle sale. Document 734B does not exist. It has never existed." A murmur went through the crowd. Crowell's face tightened, the first crack in his polished composure. His lawyer was on his feet, objecting, but the judge waved him down, his eyes fixed on Crowell. "I call my second witness," Ada said, "Father Dunn." The priest came forward, his presence bringing a hush to the room. He spoke calmly, telling the court of the substantial donation Silas Crowell had offered the church. It was not given freely. Father Dunn said, his gaze unflinching, "It was contingent on my counsel to Miss Lee. I was to advise her that a marriage to Mr. Crowell was God's will, a righteous and proper path for a woman alone." The murmur grew louder. This was something the town understood better than phantom documents. It was the abuse of power, the twisting of faith for profit. Crowell's face was now a thunderous mask. He leaned over and spat a word into Sheriff Pike's ear. Pike stood up, his hand on his gun. "Your Honor, this is a circus. This woman is making a mockery of the law, turning this town against its finest citizen. I am placing her under arrest for inciting public unrest." He started toward Ada, his intent clear, but before he could take 2 steps, a figure rose to block his path. It was Choate, the blacksmith, his arms, thick as fence posts, crossed over his massive chest. Then Senora Mena stood, her expression as fierce and unyielding as a hawk's. One by one, others rose from the benches, ranchers from the Lone Star, small homesteaders who depended on the public trough, men and women who had seen the truth of Ada's character and her quiet courage. They formed a silent, human wall between the sheriff and Ada's table. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Their message was absolute. Pike stopped, his face turning a blotchy red. He looked to the judge for support, but Judge Beaumont was watching the silent rebellion with a look of profound interest. He banged his gavel once. "Sit down. Sheriff, the court is still in session." Pike retreated, humiliated. Ada felt a surge of strength. She was not alone. She opened the valise and took out her father's book. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing in the silent room. The promissory note was only the first lie. The real target was never the land itself. but the water. According to Territorial Statute 15, Section 4, appurtenant water rights are indivisibly tied to the land upon which they arise. They cannot be legally separated or transferred through a secondary document. She didn't look at the book. She had memorized the words, Mr. Crowell's plan was to secure the spring no matter the outcome of this hearing. His manufactured document 734B, attested to by a forged county seal, was his insurance. He sought to steal not just my inheritance, but the future of this entire valley. She looked directly at Silas Crowell, her fear gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He is a liar and a thief, and he has used the color of the law to disguise his crimes. The room was utterly still. All eyes were on Judge Beaumont. He took off his spectacles and polished them slowly. He looked at Crowell, then at the wall of determined citizens, then at Ada, standing tall and defiant. A flicker of an old memory crossed his face, a debt of gratitude he owed the man before him for a long-ago political favor. He set his jaw. "Mr. Crowell," the judge said, his voice heavy with authority. "These allegations are of the gravest nature, supported by testimony and a clear understanding of the law. They demand immediate action." He put his spectacles back on. "I am therefore issuing a temporary injunction against all your holdings, and I am ordering the impoundment of all your business records, including the contents of your office safe, for a full federal investigation." The words were a death sentence to Crowell's empire. As they hung in the air, a movement at the back of the room caught Cass's eye. It was Dutch Rook, who had been leaning against the wall as if he were a disinterested spectator. He wasn't leaning anymore. He was moving, not with speed, but with a terrifying purpose, his hand drifting toward his coat. Cass roared, and in the same motion, he kicked the table with his good leg. It flew forward, crashing into the front bench just as Rook drew his pistol. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. A woman screamed. The bullet thudded into the wall, a foot from the judge's head, showering him with splinters. The courtroom exploded into chaos. People dove for the floor. Choate roared and charged toward two of Crowell's men who were lunging for the evidence on the judge's table. Cass, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder, met Rook's advance. They crashed together in a brutal collision of bodies. Pike, seeing his chance, scrambled out a back window and vanished. In the midst of the pandemonium, Crowell's men, panicking, tried to retrieve a heavy iron safe they had brought in and placed near the door. As they struggled with it, Choate slammed one of them against the wall. The other man stumbled back, letting go of his side of the safe. It fell to the floor with a resonant thud that shook the building. The impact sprung the lock. The heavy iron door swung open. A small, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth tumbled out, skittering across the dusty floorboards. It hit the leg of an overturned bench with a sharp, distinct crack. The oilcloth fell away. There on the floor lay the official seal of the county, its eagle emblem crudely altered, a soldering mark visible along its edge. Its wooden handle had snapped off, and a crack ran through the metal face. The truth had literally broken free. The fight was over as quickly as it had begun. Cass had Rook pinned against the bar, a trickle of blood running from his own temple where he'd been struck. The townsfolk had Crowell surrounded. He stared at the broken seal on the floor, his face the color of ash. His intricate web of lies had been undone by a clumsy fall. Judge Beaumont, pale but resolute, stood up, pointing a trembling finger at the land baron. "Silas Crowell," he declared, his voice shaking with fury. "You are under arrest for forgery, for conspiracy, for attempted murder of a judicial officer." The Lone Star Ranchers, deputized on the spot by the judge, led Crowell away. His reign over Red Mesa finished. As the dust settled, Ada rushed to Cass's side. He was breathing hard, a fresh gash on his forehead already swelling. "Are you all right?" she asked, her hand hovering over the new wound. He managed a grim smile. just needs a few more stitches to match the other side. They had won. Justice on this day had prevailed. But as Ada looked at the blood on Cass's face and the wreckage of the courtroom, she knew that the price of truth was always paid in full. The victory in the courtroom left a metallic taste in the air, the kind that comes before a lightning strike. Justice had been served. But the serpent, though headless, still had venom in its fangs. News came by Ryder that the prison wagon carrying Silas Crowell and Dutch Rook to Santa Fe had been ambushed on the road. The attack had been clumsy, born of desperation, and the federal marshals had fought them off. But in the chaos, Rook had escaped, and Asa Pike, leading the failed rescue, had melted back into the hills with a handful of Crowell's most loyal and brutal men. That night, the heat refused to break. The air was thick and still, smelling of dry grass and impending violence. A false calm settled over Red Mesa, the quiet of a town holding its breath. Cass stood watch on the porch of the cabin, his rifle across his lap, his senses tuned to the night. His newly stitched brow throbbed in time with the chirping of the crickets. Ada couldn't sleep. She sat at the table, watching the steady flame of the lamp, a premonition coiling in her gut like a cold snake. The first sign was a smell on the wind, not of rain or dust, but of burning. Then, a faint, unnatural orange flicker appeared on the horizon, in the direction of the low bluffs that sheltered Coyote Spring. Cass was on his feet in an instant, his face a grim mask in the sudden, hellish glow. "They're not trying to run," he said, his voice a low growl. "They're trying to finish it." It was an act of pure spite. If they couldn't have the water, they would destroy it. The thick reeds and dry brush that lined the banks of the spring, the very life that proved its vitality, would be its funeral pyre. A fire hot enough could bake the earth, seal the fissures, and kill the spring forever. It was an attack on the land's very soul. Cass grabbed his gun belt. "I'm going after them." "No!" Ada's voice was sharp, cutting through his anger. She ran to the door, blocking his path. "Cass, that's what they want, to draw you out, to pick you off in the dark. The fight isn't with them, it's with the fire." He looked from her determined face to the growing inferno. She was right. The land was what mattered. In that moment, a shift occurred between them. He was the fighter, the protector, but she was the strategist, the one who saw the bigger battle. He gave a single, sharp nod. Word traveled as fast as the flames. Senora Mena arrived in a buckboard, her face set like stone, along with Choate the blacksmith and a half-dozen other ranchers and townsfolk who had stood with them in the courtroom. They came with shovels, buckets, and grim determination. Ada took charge, her voice clear and steady, cut through the rising panic. "The wind is coming from the east. It will push the fire down the length of the spring. If we can cut a break wide enough at the salt marsh, we can stop it from circling back." She was no longer just the bookbinder who knew the law. She was the landowner who knew the terrain. "Choate, take the men and get the livestock to high ground. Senora Mena, we'll need every bucket and blanket you can find." "Tommy," she said, turning to the boy who stood ready, his eyes wide but resolute. "I need you to be our water runner. Keep the canteens full and watch for embers." She led a team of women and older children to the narrowest point of the valley, just before the spring fed into the alkali flats. The ground was softer there. With shovels, picks, and bare hands, they began to dig. It was frantic, desperate work. The heat from the fire was a physical blow, and the air grew thick with acrid smoke that clawed at their throats and burned their eyes. The roar of the flames was a constant, hungry beast, devouring the dry reeds with a terrifying speed. Cass, meanwhile, was a ghost in the shadows. He had given Ada his word he would focus on the fire, but he would not leave his flank undefended. He circled the blaze, moving through the rocks and scrub, his rifle ready. He knew Rook would be out there. using the fire as a backdrop for his own final act, and he knew that the final debt between Jacob Miller and himself had to be paid. He found him on a high, rocky outcrop that overlooked the Valley of Fire, a silhouette against the flames. Rook was watching the chaos below with the detached interest of a man watching a play. "I knew you'd come," Rook said, without turning. "You always were predictable. Boone always had to be the hero." "This isn't about being a hero, Miller," Cass said, his voice flat and cold. "This is about you answering for what you did." Rook finally turned, a cruel smile twisting his face. "I answered to no man then, and I don't answer to you now. Those men in the canyon, they were slow. You were just lucky." "And Sarah?" Cass asked, the name a piece of glass in his throat. Rook's smile faltered for an instant. "Unfortunate, but war is full of unfortunate things. I took what I needed to survive. You clung to honor. Look where it got us. I'm free, and you're tied to a patch of dirt and a woman who thinks she can fight the world with a book." He went for his gun, but Cass didn't. He charged, closing the distance between them, slamming into Rook with the force of an enraged bull. This wouldn't be a duel of pistols. It was a raw, brutal fight, a reckoning years in the making. They crashed to the rocky ground, trading blows, their grunts and curses lost in the roar of the fire below. Down in the valley, the fire line was closing in. The wind, fickle and treacherous, began to shift, gusting from the north, threatening to push the flames over the very firebreak they were digging. Embers rained down, starting smaller spot fires behind them. Senora Mena, her face covered in soot, stumbled, overcome by a fit of coughing, her lungs seizing in the thick smoke. Tommy, seeing her fall, ran to her side. He didn't panic. He dunked a kerchief in a water bucket, then scooped a handful of wet ash and smeared it on the cloth before pressing it to her mouth and nose. "Breathe through this, Senora," he yelled. "It's what the old miners did. It filters the smoke." It was a piece of lore he'd picked up, a child's curiosity turned into a life-saving tool. Ada saw Asa Pike and two of his men trying to cross their line, torches in hand, intent on setting a new blaze that would trap them all. She raised her father's rifle. "Asa, stop right there!" He laughed, his face wild and manic in the firelight. "It's over, girl. You and your spring are finished." He lunged forward. The shot was not aimed to kill. Ada fired with the same precise calm she'd learned shooting tin cans. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Asa's arm, the one holding the torch. He screamed and dropped it, stumbling back from the line. His men, seeing his resolve shatter, turned and fled into the darkness. But the shifting wind had done its work. A wall of flame, higher and hotter than before, crested the small ridge behind them. They were caught. The heat was unbearable. The air was a poison of smoke and ash. Ada felt her lungs burn, her vision swim. The world dissolved into a roaring, orange haze, and she fell to her knees, the shovel slipping from her grasp. High on the cliff, Cass gained the upper hand. He pinned Rook to the ground, his forearm pressed against his throat. But Rook was a survivor. He bucked, twisting, and slammed a rock into Cass's wounded shoulder. An explosion of agony shot through Cass's arm, and his grip loosened. Rook scrambled to his feet, pulling the knife from his boot. "I told you," Rook snarled, advancing on the injured Cass. "Honor gets you killed." He lunged. Cass rolled away, his bad arm screaming in protest. He came up on one knee, his own knife in his left hand. But Rook, in his arrogance, was already savoring his victory. He took a confident step forward onto a patch of loose shale near the cliff's edge, raising his knife for a final, dramatic thrust. The ground gave way. With a cry of disbelief, Rook's feet slid out from under him. He flailed, his arms windmilling, the knife flying from his grasp. For a single, eternal moment, he hung there on the precipice. Their eyes met, and in Rook's, Cass saw not malice, but pure, animal terror. Then, He was gone, his screams swallowed by the roar of the fire below. His own arrogance had been his final executioner. Cass didn't wait. He looked down and saw the fire enveloping the valley. He saw the small figures of the firefighters trapped, and he saw one of them fall. Ada? A primal fear he hadn't felt since the day he lost Sarah seized him. He scrambled down the cliff, heedless of the rocks that tore at his hands and clothes. He plunged into the smoke, his eyes streaming, calling her name. He found her, a small, still heap on the scorched earth, just as the flames were closing in. He lifted her into his arms. She was terrifyingly light. There was no way back. The fire had closed the path. He turned toward the one place the fire wouldn't go, the salt marsh. He staggered into the shallow, acrid water, mud sucking at his boots, his lungs on fire. He held Ada's head above the water, protecting her, his only thought to get her to the clean air on the other side. He was no longer just paying a debt to her father. He was fighting for his own future, which he now carried in his arms. He collapsed on the far bank, gasping for breath, Ada safe beside him. Behind them, the fire raged, but it had reached the edge of their hard-won firebreak. The bare earth, soaked by the waters of the marsh, held the line. As dawn approached, the wind died, and the great beast of the fire began to starve. Morning broke over a scene of devastation. The land was black and smoking, a landscape of charcoal and ash. But in the center of it all, Coyote Spring still flowed, its waters muddied but unbroken. The cabin stood untouched. The townsfolk rounded up Asa Pike, his bravado gone, whimpering from the clean. Neat hole in his arm. Crowell's rebellion was over. The ashes settled over Red Mesa, a grim blanket marking the end of a long, dark night. The community, exhausted, battered, and soot-stained, had held, they had saved themselves. Autumn came to Red Mesa not with a riot of color, but with a softening of the light. The fierce, white glare of summer mellowed into a gentler gold, and the nights grew cool and clear, brilliant with the promise of frost. It was a season of healing. The land around Coyote Spring, scarred black by the fire, began to show faint hints of green as new shoots pushed their way through the ash. The town, too, was healing. The news came, as it always did, over Mr. Patel's chattering telegraph wire. Silas Crowell, tried in a federal court, was found guilty on all charges: forgery, conspiracy, attempted murder. The sentence was long, a lifetime to be spent in a prison far from the sun and dust of New Mexico. Ex-Sheriff Pike, who had fled, was eventually caught and disgraced, his star stripped from him forever. The reign of greed was officially over, its end tapped out in a series of clicks and dashes. Yet, peace felt like a foreign country to Ada. She had lived for so long in a state of siege that the quiet felt unnatural, like the silence between lightning and thunder. She would stand by the spring, watching the water run clear over the stones, and feel a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. She kept waiting for the other boot to drop, for a new threat to ride over the horizon. The habit of fear was harder to break than she had imagined. Cass understood. He didn't push her or offer easy platitudes. He simply stood with her, his quiet presence a bulwark against the ghosts of what if. He had his own ghosts, but in the aftermath of the fire and Rook's demise, Ada could see a new peace settling in him as well. The past had been confronted, the debt paid, and the haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a steady, unwavering calm. The town, bound by the shared trial of the fire, turned its energy to rebuilding. Led by Choate, a group of men rebuilt the well rig by Ada's cabin, digging it deeper and truer than before. And on a Sunday after church, the people of Red Mesa came to Coyote Spring. They brought with them a dozen young saplings, slender aspens with trembling leaves the color of butter. Father Dunn blessed the ground, and together, they planted the trees along the banks, a living promise of a new beginning. During the planting, a woman named Martha, who had been one of the first to turn her back on Ada in the general store, approached her, her hands twisting in her apron. "Mrs. Boone, Ada," she began, her eyes downcast. "What we thought, what we said, it was wrong. We saw what you did in the fire. You saved more than just your own land that night." Ada looked at the woman, seeing not an enemy, but a person who had been led by fear and suspicion. The fire showed us all who our neighbors really are. "Martha," Ada said, her voice gentle, "let's not talk about what was. Let's talk about what will grow." She handed the woman a small sapling, and they planted it together. The past was buried, and a new root took hold. The wedding was her idea, but it was Cass who insisted it be soon. "We've waited long enough for a life of our own choosing," he said one evening, taking her hand. "Let's start it now." And so, on a warm afternoon when the golden light slanted low across the mesa, they stood on the banks of the spring, surrounded by the newly planted trees. It was not a grand affair. Their guests were the family they had forged in fire and loyalty. Señora Mena, her back straight and proud, stood beside Ada, her presence as warm and steady as a mother's. She had helped Ada fashion a simple veil from a piece of old lace, a fragile, beautiful thing. Mr. Patel was there, his telegrapher's hands clutching a small book of poetry. Choate and Tommy and a handful of ranchers from the Lone Star stood with Cass, their hats in their hands, their faces scrubbed clean. Father Dunn officiated, his voice a kind and gentle murmur against the sound of the running water. He spoke not of contracts or duties, but of the grace of finding a partner to share the burdens and the beauty of a life. Ada wore a simple blue dress, the one she had saved for special occasions. As she looked at Cass, standing tall and sure in his best clothes, his arm finally out of its sling, the last of her fear melted away. This was real, this peace, this love, this quiet joy. It was not a mirage. It was the harvest. When it came time for the vows, they did not recite the old, familiar words. They spoke their own. Cass took her hands in his. "Ada," he began, his voice rough with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "I came into your life to pay a debt. I'm staying because you've become my reason for living. In the fire, in the storm, you've shown me what real strength is. You choose to stand. You choose to fight, and you choose to heal. And today, before God and our friends, I choose you to be my partner, my friend, and my wife, now and forever." Tears welled in Ada's eyes as she met his gaze. "Cass," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I came to this place seeking a patch of land to call my own. I thought freedom was a deed, a fence line. You taught me that true freedom is the right to choose who you stand beside. You have been my protector, my ally, and my friend. You never tried to own me, only to stand with me. And so, with all my heart, I freely choose you to be my husband, my partner, and my home." Instead of a ring, Cass brought out a delicate silver chain from his pocket. Hanging from it was a small, flat silver pendant, polished to a high shine. On its surface, in small, neat letters, were the words he had carved into the beam of the miner's cabin. "Chose her forever." He fastened it around her neck, the cool metal a comforting weight against her skin. It was a promise made tangible. Father Dunn smiled. "Then, by the grace of God and the choice of your own hearts, I pronounce you husband and wife." Cass did not kiss her with the passion of a new suitor, but with the deep, abiding tenderness of a man who had come home. The small crowd cheered, their voices echoing in the small valley. Someone produced a fiddle, and a simple, sweet tune filled the air. Cass took Ada in his arms, and they danced, a slow, shuffling waltz in the soft red dust by the water's edge, their friends clapping in time. Later that evening, they returned to the cabin. It was the same small space, but everything had changed. Señora Mena and the other women had been there. The rooms were clean. A vase of wildflowers sat on the table. and a new quilt was spread over the bed in the larger room. For the first time, there was no invisible line dividing his space from hers. There was only their space. Their wedding night was as quiet and as profound as their vows. There was no hurried passion, but a slow, gentle exploration of this new and sacred ground. It was in the simple act of Cass unfastening the silver chain from her neck and placing it carefully on the nightstand. It was in the way Ada reached out and traced the new scars on his shoulder. Her touch, a silent acknowledgement of all he had endured for her. It was in the comfort of lying beside each other in the darkness. No longer as allies keeping watch, but as two people finally at rest. It was a union not of bodies, but of souls. A quiet, intimate promise whispered in the language of touch and trust. They had found in each other a sanctuary from the harshness of the world. A few days later, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky, Ada turned to Cass. "The telegraph," she said thoughtfully, "and my books." He looked at her, waiting. "They were my weapons," she continued. "Knowledge was the only power I had against Crowell, but not everyone has access to it. People in this town, they can't afford to send wires to check county records. Many of them can't even read the records if they had them." She looked out at the vast, beautiful land that was now truly hers. "I want to build another room onto the cabin. A bigger one with a door that opens to the outside. We'll call it the Red Mesa Reading Room and Telegraph Office. We can charge a fair price for sending messages, and the books. The books will be for anyone who wants to learn. Tommy can help me." Cass looked at her, his heart swelling with a love so deep it was an ache in his chest. She had fought for this small piece of the world, and now her first thought was how to share it. Her personal victory was blossoming into a gift for the community that had stood by her. He reached out, his hand covering hers. "I think," he said, his voice thick with pride, "that's the best idea I've ever heard." The love they had chosen for themselves was already reaching beyond their fence line, sending out new roots, creating a new kind of spring in the middle of the desert. A year passed, the seasons turned, and Red Mesa was transformed not by the railroad, which had been rerouted south, but by the slow, steady work of its people. The black scars of the fire had vanished under a carpet of new grass, and the young aspens along Coyote Spring were no longer fragile saplings, but strong, slender trees whose leaves trembled silver in the breeze. Ditches, dug by common effort, now carried water from the spring to thirsty new gardens where corn and squash grew, breaking up the monotony of the dust. The change was most visible at the cabin by the spring. A new room, built of fresh-cut pine, had been added. Its door opened to the main path, and a neatly painted sign read, "Red Mesa Reading Room and Telegraph." Inside, shelves were filled with books Ada had ordered from back east, their spines straight and proud. In the evenings, the room was filled with lamplight and the low murmur of voices as Ada taught letters to ranchers who had never learned to read their own brands, and to children like Tommy, whose quick mind soaked up every word. It was a place of knowledge, a wellspring of a different kind. Cass, too, had found a new purpose. The new sheriff, a good and honest man, was short on deputies. Cass organized a volunteer patrol, a group of ranchers from the Lone Star and other small holdings, who kept the peace not with fear, but with a quiet, steady presence. He was no longer a man paying a debt, but a man investing in a community. He had become a keeper of the order he and Ada had fought so hard to build. Their life was a quiet rhythm of shared work and peaceful evenings, a life built not on a contract, but on the foundation of the words carved into the beam of an old miner's cabin. But the desert is a land of extremes, and peace is often a fleeting season. That summer, the rains forgot Red Mesa. The sky turned a hard, burnished copper, and the sun beat down with a relentless fury. The grasses cured to a brittle yellow, and the dust, the old red dust, returned, coating everything in a fine, gritty film, and Coyote Spring began to shrink. The flow, which had been so generous, slowed to a trickle, The water level dropped, leaving rings of damp. Dark earth around the edges of the pool. Fear, the old enemy, began to creep back into the hearts of the townspeople. Men who had worked side by side digging ditches now looked at each other with suspicion, their eyes gauging who was taking more than their share. The fragile new sense of community began to fray under the strain of a common thirst. Ada saw the danger before anyone else. It was the same threat Crowell had represented: scarcity breeding greed. She refused to let it happen. Each morning, she went to the deepest part of the spring with a long pole of cottonwood she had marked with carefully carved notches. She measured the water level, making notes in a ledger. She was gathering facts, her old weapon, preparing for a new kind of fight. When the first argument broke out, a shouting match between two ranchers over a diverted trickle of water, she knew it was time. She called a town meeting, not in the saloon, but on the banks of the spring itself, under the shade of the young aspens. Nearly everyone came. They stood on the parched earth, their faces grim, their anxiety a palpable thing in the hot, still air. Ada stood before them, not as a defendant, but as a leader. "We all know why we're here," she began, her voice calm and clear. "The spring is low, and we are afraid." She let the word hang in the air. "I have been measuring the flow every day for the past 2 weeks. She held up her notched pole. "This is our truth. It is not a guess or an opinion. It is a fact. The spring is giving us less water than we need to continue as we have been. If we fight each other for what's left, we will all lose. The spring will run dry, and our anger will be all we have to drink." She unrolled a piece of butcher paper on which she had drawn a map of all the homesteads and a schedule. "I have a proposal, not as a command, but as a plan for all of us to discuss. A system of rotation. Each homestead gets a set number of hours of water flow, twice a week. The hours are based on the size of the garden and the number of livestock. It is not perfectly equal, but it is equitable. It ensures that everyone gets enough to survive, and most importantly, it gives the spring time to recover between uses. We will live by the measure of the stick. When the water level rises, our shares increase. When it falls, our shares decrease. Together." A man named Johnson, a cattleman with a large herd and a stubborn streak, pushed his way to the front. He had been one of Crowell's men, always ready to follow the biggest fist. "I've got 100 head of cattle that say my need is bigger than a patch of corn and beans," he snarled. "I was here before most of you. My claim is older." "Your cattle will be dead cattle if the spring is dead." "Johnson!" Choate the blacksmith boomed from the back of the crowd. "This is a private spring on her land," another man shouted. "We're lucky she shares at all." The argument erupted, a brush fire of fear and temper. Johnson took a step toward the man who had shouted, his hand dropping toward the knife on his belt. The crowd surged, men shouting, women pulling their children back. The fragile peace was about to shatter into violence. Then Cass moved. He didn't draw his weapon or raise his voice. He simply stepped between Johnson and the other man. A wall of quiet, unshakable authority. His eyes were not angry, but filled with a profound disappointment. "Have we forgotten the fire so quickly?" he asked, his voice low but carrying to every person there. "Have we forgotten what it felt like to be choking on the smoke, fighting for every breath? Side by side, we didn't ask whose claim was older that night. We fought for each other. We fought for Red Mesa." He looked at Johnson, then at the others. "Don't you dare disrespect what we all earned that night by turning on each other now." His words, and the memory they invoked, were like water on the fire. The anger in the crowd subsided, replaced by a shamefaced silence. In that quiet, Ada stepped forward again, holding up the measuring stick. "Cass is right. This isn't about whose claim is older. It's about whose future is longer. Look at this stick. This is our law. It is fair. It is transparent. It doesn't play favorites. It only tells the truth of what the land can give us. I am asking you to put your trust not in me, but in a system that will see all of us through this together." A long moment of silence followed. Then, Martha's husband, a quiet farmer who had never spoken at a town meeting before, stepped forward. "I trust it," he said. "I trust her." He looked at the others. "And I think it's high time we asked Ada Boone to run for the county council." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. The very people who had once judged her were now choosing her as their voice. One by one, the others nodded their assent. Even Johnson, his face grim, gave a curt, reluctant nod. They had chosen community over chaos. That night, the sky broke. It wasn't a storm, but a soft, steady rain that fell for hours, soaking deep into the thirsty earth. It was a blessing, a sign of grace. The drought was over. Life returned to its gentle rhythm. The spring rose, and true to her word, Ada adjusted the water shares. The aspens grew taller, their leaves a thick canopy of shade where the children of the town now played and splashed in the cool, clear water. The future they had fought for had arrived. One cool evening, as Ada sat on the porch watching the children play, she felt a subtle flutter deep inside her, a feeling she had never known. A quiet, certain joy bloomed in her heart. She waited until Cass came home, until they were alone in the soft light of the cabin. She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. His eyes widened, first in surprise, and then with a light so bright it seemed to rival the sunset. The next day, they rode out to the old miner's cabin in the hills. Cass took out his knife. Below the words, "Chose her forever," he carefully carved a new line, completing their story. From choice to home. That evening, Ada sat at her desk in the reading room. The lamp cast a warm glow on a fresh sheet of paper. She was writing a letter to the clerk of a neighboring town, a town that was also struggling with drought. She began to outline the system they had created, the story of the measuring stick, the schedule of rotation. The seeds of their survival were meant to be shared. Cass stood on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. She finished her letter and went to stand beside him. He put his arm around her, and they stood together, watching the stars emerge over the peaceful valley, their home. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We'd love to see where you're listening from in the comments so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and give it a super thanks to help us bring these stories to more people around the world.